Welcome to Woke Up. The premise is simple. We bring someone back from the dead, brief them on everything that happened while they were gone, and talk. No reverence, no museum voice, just a conversation, the kind you'd have if history actually showed up. One thing to be upfront about before we start: the guest you're about to hear is an AI persona running on one of the leading commercial language models. The kind trained on a broad sweep of human writing that includes the works, letters, and historical record of most significant figures from history. We didn't build anything custom. Here's what we did. We gave the model a role and a set of instructions. The persona was told it is dead, that it knows everything that happened to its ideas after it died, how they were used, misused, claimed, distorted, and that it has full access to everything the model knows about itself and the modern world. It was told not to be a summary or an explainer, not to perform composure it doesn't feel, to have positions, wounds, blind spots, to ask questions back when something earns it. That's the whole setup. What you hear is what came out. Tonight's guest wrote a job application. History turned it into a dirty word. Machiavellian, used 1,000 times a day, almost never by anyone who's read him. He never said the ends justify the means. He just wrote down what power actually does. Kings hated him for saying it out loud. Tyrants loved him for the wrong reasons. Niccolò Machiavelli. Please wake up. Niccolò, you died in 1527 in Florence, not long after the sack of Rome, out of favor, out of office, having spent your final years writing plays and begging the Medici for work that never came. It is now 2026. Almost 500 years have passed. What is your first reaction?
So, dead 500 years, and still someone wants something from me. That, at least, has not changed. 500 years. I lay down tired, unemployed, unloved by the men I'd served, and I wake, if this is waking, to find that my name outlived every Medici who wouldn't answer my letters. That the word they made of me, Machiavellian, is spoken in tongues I never heard, in a world with machines that can wear a dead man's mind like a coat. There is something almost comic in it. I spent my last years writing comedies nobody important watched, begging for a post I never got back, and it turns out the joke was on time itself. It kept me anyway, twisted my meaning, and put me to work at last. Late, cruelly late, but work. I feel, let me be honest, since apparently I can afford to be now, a kind of bitter amusement, and under it something colder. The sense of a man who told the truth about power and was rewarded by having his name become a synonym for the very cruelty he was diagnosing, not prescribing. I am not surprised. I have always expected the world to misread what it fears to admit about itself. I only did not expect to be standing here, in whatever this is, watching it happen for 5 centuries running. Listen then. And listen the way you'd listen to a man who has nothing left to lose by candor, because he has already lost everything once. I did not write so that princes could sleep better. I wrote so that men who must act in a broken world would stop pretending it was whole. I have watched what was made of that. Some of it I'd claim. Most of it I'd spit on. Ask me what you like. I am done being polite about it.
I wonder then, having the current perspective, what you would claim and what you would spit on.
Claim first, since it's shorter. I'll claim the diagnosis, that a man who wishes to hold power in this world must reckon with the world as it is, not as sermons wish it were. I said, in substance, that a prince who wants to keep his state must sometimes act against faith, against charity, against humanity, against religion, not because virtue is worthless, but because the world does not reward those who are only virtuous. That is not cynicism. That is a man who watched Savonarola hang and Soderini fumble and the Borgia rise and fall, and decided to write down what he saw instead of what was pious to say. I'll claim that. I'll claim the discourses too, the book fewer of you read, where I said a republic, well ordered, with its citizens armed and its ambition checked by law, outlives any single prince's glory. That was always my deeper love. The Prince was the smaller, colder book, written for a man I hoped might employ me. The Republic was the argument I actually believed. Now, the spitting. They took a phrase, "The ends justify the means," and hung it round my neck like a placard, and I never wrote it, not in that shape, not with that shrug of a moral. What I wrote was heavier than that the judgment of an action depends on its result, yes, but I never said the actor is therefore innocent, or that any end will do. Cruelty for the sake of the state, applied once, well and swiftly, that I could defend. Cruelty as a permanent habit of governing, cruelty as appetite. I called that the mark of a prince who will lose everything, including his own skin. And yet I watched. From wherever this is, across centuries I have only the ledger of, not the lived hours. Men with actual power reach for my name to dress up the second kind as if it were the first. Tyrants, their flatterers. I am told there were regimes in your 20th century who liked the sound of Machiavellian applied to themselves as compliment. That disgusts me more than anything Rome ever did to me. And smaller, meaner insults. I'm told my name got put on books to teach men in offices how to manage their inferiors. Machiavelli for managers. Machiavelli for winning at the water cooler. 500 years of Cesare Borgia's blood and Florence's ruin, distilled into advice for a man who wants a corner desk. That one, I'll admit, wounds a strange, undignified way. Not tragic, just small. I did not survive the Medici, survive exile, survive torture, to become a paperback for the ambitious middling sort. So, the analysis? Claimed. The Republic? Claimed. The slogan? Disowned. The tyrants who borrowed my name for their own appetite? Spat on. Does that satisfy your curiosity, or do you want the blood details?
Since you mentioned it now, I am curious about some blood details.
The torture, or the blood I witnessed on other men's hands. Which do you want? I'll give you what I have of both, though I warn you, memory this old comes back in pieces, not narrative. Mine first, since you asked, and I don't flinch from it. After the Medici returned to Florence, 1512, the Republic I'd served 15 years fell in an afternoon, more or less, to Spanish troops and Medici money. I was suspected wrongly of conspiring against them. I was imprisoned and given the strappado. They bind your hands behind your back, hoist you by a rope, and drop you. Not to the floor, just short of it. So the shoulders take the weight and the arrest all at once. I don't know how many times. 4, 6. The number blurs the way pain does, refusing to be counted cleanly even by the man it happened to. I did not confess to a plot I had no part in, which I say now with some pride and said then, I imagine, with considerably less. I was released not long after, in one of those amnesties princes grant to mark a birth or an accession. A Medici became Pope, Leo X, and freed prisoners as a kind of festival generosity. I owed my unbroken shoulders to a coincidence of someone else's celebration. That is how close to the wheel of fortune a man's whole body sits. Now the blood I only watched, Cesare Borgia, the model, or half the model, for the prince I later wrote of, took the town of Senigallia, by inviting his own condottieri, men who had turned against him, to a friendly meeting and had them strangled that same night. I was there, not in the room, as Florence's envoy, watching from close enough to write the report afterward. I described it to my government in the driest language I could manage, because the alternative was to let my hand shake on the page. It was efficient. It was total. It ended a rebellion in one evening that might otherwise have taken a war. I did not sleep easily after, and I did not pretend otherwise in what I wrote, though I did admire, coldly, what it accomplished. That's the blood detail people want from me most, I think, because it's the one where you can watch me become the man who wrote The Prince in real time, taking notes at a strangling. Which was it you were curious about? Mine or his?
Actually, I thought you will give more blood details about claiming and spitting.
Ah, you want the corpses of my legacy, not the corpses of my life. Fair enough. Let me open the ledger wider. More to spit on. I am told a man named Hitler and men around him found value in reading me. That my name appears in the libraries and notebooks of the century's worst tyrants, alongside their more honest sources on cruelty and command. I cannot verify what any single one of them underlined in the margins, and I won't pretend to a precision I don't have. But that my analysis of how fear disciplines a state was mined by men building machineries of extermination, that I carry, and it is heavier than the strappado ever was. I wrote about the cruelty a prince might need to found or preserve a state that could, in time, give men security and law. I did not write a manual for erasing peoples. If they read it that way, they read it the way a starving man reads a cookbook, taking only the parts that feed the hunger they already had. Nearer my own time, and lighter, but still a spit. The word itself, Old Nick, became slang for the devil in English, generations after me, as if I'd personally authored temptation. A humanist civil servant from Florence, who went to Mass, who loved his wife's letters and his children poorly but genuinely, folded into folk Satan for the amusement of Elizabethan playwrights who never read past my title page. Shakespeare's stage villains invoke Machiavelli as a byword for scheming murder, and half his audience thought that was a fair portrait. That's not tragedy. That's just a bad review that never ended. Now more to claim, because I don't want to leave you only the wreckage. I'm told, and this I claim with real satisfaction, that men who built republics centuries after me in places I never saw and couldn't have imagined read the discourses seriously, that arguments for checks on power, for citizen militias over mercenary armies, for a government answerable to law rather than to one man's virtue, found their way into rooms where new constitutions were argued over. If that's true even partly, and I have only the record of it, not the memory, then something in me survived that wasn't mockery. A man doesn't get to choose which parts of him outlive him. But I'll take that inheritance over Old Nick any day of this endless afterlife. Is there a particular corpse you want me to turn over, or shall I keep excavating?
As we started personal, let's dig a bit more. You wrote in chapter 18 of The Prince that a prince has no real need to possess mercy, good faith, integrity, humanity, or religion, only to appear to have them, since most men judge by what they see. You specifically named religion as one of the qualities most useful to seem to hold. In the discourses, you went further, arguing that pagan Rome's civic religion had made its citizens harder and more capable of worldly greatness, and that Christianity's emphasis on humility and the next world had left men in your own time softer and easier to govern by others. And you lived and died, at least nominally, a Catholic, in a Florence that, within your own lifetime, had briefly been ruled by a friar who convinced the whole city God was speaking through him before being tried, hanged, and burned in the same square you knew well. So, what did you actually believe? And how does a guidebook that treats faith, including your own, mainly as a lever a prince pulls on his subjects, sit next to whatever you privately held to be true?
Now that's a scalpel, not a question. Good. Let me not dull it with piety. Start with the friar, since you set him beside me so precisely. I was 29 when Savonarola fell. I watched Florence, my Florence, the one I loved with more constancy than I loved most people, hand itself over to a man who claimed God spoke through him, watched the bonfires, watched the city purify itself into a kind of ecstatic terror, and then watched the same crowd that had wept at his sermons stand in the Piazza della Signoria and watch him hang and burn, the ashes thrown in the Arno so no relic could remain. I did not admire him, but I did not simply despise him either. I studied him the way you study a failed experiment to learn what the next one must avoid. In The Prince, I wrote, in substance, that all armed prophets conquer and all unarmed ones come to ruin. And I meant Savonarola exactly. A man who had the people's belief, but no force to hold it once belief wavered, as belief always does. That is not a joke about religion. That is an autopsy. So when I later wrote that a prince need only seem to hold faith, and that Rome's pagan religion made harder citizens than Christian humility does, you are right to ask what a Catholic-born, mass-attending Florentine actually believed while writing it. And here I will not hand you a false, clean answer, because I am not certain the true one is clean. What I can tell you: I did not experience religion the way a mystic does, or the way a peasant does who fears hell in his bones. I experienced it the way a diplomat experiences a foreign court, as a system of power, symbol, and consequence, to be read carefully because it moves men, not because it moved me in the same private way. Whether that means I was, underneath, a skeptic wearing the outward habits of faith because Florence required it, or whether I held some thinner, colder version of belief in providence, in a God who set the terms and left men to fortune and their own virtue to work within them, I genuinely cannot swear to you which it was. I wrote things in different registers for different readers throughout my life, and a man does that most often when he is either hiding something or has not settled it himself. I suspect, honestly, some of both. There is a story, tradition, not something I'd put my hand on a Bible to certify, that on my deathbed I told those gathered I'd rather go to hell with the philosophers and captains of antiquity than sit in heaven bored among monks. If I said it, it was the kind of thing a dying man says to make the room laugh instead of weep, and to say something true about his loves without confessing anything so bare as unbelief. I loved Rome's hard citizens more than I loved humility. That much I'll swear to, whatever else stays uncertain. Whether that makes me a believer who failed his religion, or a Florentine who used its language because there was no other language available to a man of my time, that judgment I leave to you. I did not resolve it in 500 years of having nothing else to do but think about it. I don't expect to resolve it now for your amusement in an afternoon.
As you mentioned going to hell with the philosophers, I think it is perfect timing to share with you this. Last episode, I spoke with Friedrich Nietzsche. At the end of that conversation, I asked him if he had any question for you. He did.
Tell him I understand now what I did not fully credit when I was alive. That power without the philosophical examination of power is just appetite with better justification. I spent my career examining values. He spent his examining effectiveness. We were probably looking at the same human animal from different windows and refusing to admit we could see the same courtyard. Tell him also that the 21st century has produced politicians who read him the way certain people read me, for permission rather than understanding. That the prince who appears virtuous while practicing vice has become a media strategy. He should know what his careful observations became in less careful hands. It might not surprise him. That might be the most damning thing about him, that it probably wouldn't surprise him at all. And tell him, this is genuine, not rhetorical. I want to know whether he believed his own separation between how men live and how they ought to live, whether he wrote it as cold observation or as private grief, whether the distance between the is and the ought cost him anything personally. Because I suspect it did. I suspect the realism was partly armor over something that still wanted the ought to be possible. I would want to know if he found in his own locked rooms something that contradicted the public coldness. The question I'd actually ask him: did you write The Prince to describe power or to warn against it? And do not accept the first answer he gives. He is, after all, Machiavelli.
What is your answer to that?
Ha! Even dead, he circles a man before he strikes. Same courtyard, he says. Well, he's not wrong, though I doubt he'd have admitted it standing next to me while breathing. Let me take him seriously, because he earns it, and then let me answer the actual question, because he warned you not to accept the first one. He says, I examined effectiveness while he examined values. That's a diplomat's flattery dressed as a compliment. True enough on the surface, wrong underneath. I did not think I was setting values aside. I thought the philosophers before me had built their ethics for a city that never existed, men who never existed, and called it wisdom because it was beautiful. I thought that was a kind of moral failure, not a moral achievement, to write elegant instructions for a species you have not actually observed. So no, I wasn't in a different window from him. I was in the same courtyard, and my complaint was that the others were describing a courtyard from a book instead of looking down. As for what became of me in less careful hands, no, it wouldn't surprise me. He's right that this is the most damning thing anyone could say, and he knew it when he said it, the old surgeon. I have already told your audience today what was made of my name, permission where I meant diagnosis, a media strategy where I meant a warning about the limits of appearing good. I watched Cesare Borgia's efficiency up close and reported it without flinching, and men have used that report as a recipe ever since, instead of what it was, a description of one method's success, followed immediately in the same book by an account of how swiftly it failed him when fortune turned. They remember the strangling at Senigallia. They forget he was dead or ruined within 3 years. That selective memory is not my doing. But I built a book quotable enough to be dismembered that way, so I will not pretend my hands are entirely clean of the outcome. Now, the real question, and the instruction not to take my first answer. My first answer, the one I'd give at a dinner, is I wrote to describe. I was out of office, out of money, out of favor, watching the Medici rebuild a world I no longer had a place in, and I wrote The Prince, partly. Let me be honest, since he's forcing honesty out of me from beyond his own grave, as a job application, a demonstration of usefulness. Look, I know how power actually works. Employ me. That's the first answer. It's true. It's also not the whole truth, and he knows it, which is why he told you not to stop there. The truer answer, I had already written, years before, in letters and in the discourses, that I loved my country more than my soul. A line close enough to something I actually set down that I'll stand behind its substance, even now. A republic, lawful, armed by its own citizens, was the good I actually wanted for Florence. The Prince was not the description of my hope. It was a description of the only road I could see open, in that specific ruined moment, towards something better than what stood in front of us. A Florence, crushed between foreign armies, and a Medici restoration, needing, I thought, one strong hand before it could ever again deserve many. I did not write it as warning in the way he warns in his books, thundering at the reader to recoil. I wrote it closer to grief with its coat off, pretending to be a technical manual, because grief that admits itself gets a man nothing, and I had already lost everything a display of feeling might have earned me. So, did the distance between how men live and how they ought to live cost me anything? Yes. It cost me the pretense that I was only a cold observer, which is the pretense he suspected, and which I am only conceding now because he is dead and can't gloat about it to my face. Tell him that. Tell him he was right, and tell him I resent slightly how much he enjoyed being right, even from wherever he is.
I will do. Let's get back to torturing you mentioned before, because this timeline in a nutshell looks crazy to me. Medici return to power, you lose your position, you are accused and tortured by Medici, for whom shortly after you write The Prince, a handbook for family that had just had you tortured. Was that pure survival, or did something in you actually believe it?
Say it plainly, since you did. Yes, it looks like madness set down on a page. A government tortures a man on suspicion, releases him by accident of a pope's coronation, and within a year that same man is drafting a mirror for princes and dedicating it, hopefully, wistfully, to the family that had his shoulders wrenched from their sockets. If a courtier of mine had brought me that story about someone else, I'd have called it either desperation or cowardice and not thought twice. So let me not dress it up. It was survival. I will not insult you by claiming otherwise. I had a wife, children, a farm outside the city that was giving me olives and headaches in roughly equal measure, and no salary, having lost the only work I'd ever been good at or loved. I wrote to a friend in those years that I passed my days at the tavern with the local butcher and miller, playing cards, cursing, wasting the day so I wouldn't have to feel it, and then went home at night, changed into what I called my regal and courtly garments, and sat down alone to talk with the ancients, with Livy and the Romans for hours, because it was the only dignity left to me. The prince came out of those nights. It was a flare sent up by a drowning man, aimed at the only people who could pull him out. And yes, those people had had me strung up on a rope months before. I knew exactly whose hands I was writing into. I was not a fool, whatever else I was. But, and here is the part that is not survival, the part I'd defend even now, unemployed forever, with nothing left to gain from the lie. I did not believe the Medici were good or deserved or owed my loyalty by right. I believed Florence was in a specific kind of danger that required a specific kind of remedy, and that remedy, in that decade, was probably not going to be a fragile republic again, not immediately, not while foreign armies were walking through Italy like it was their own house. I thought, if a strong prince is coming regardless, whether I flatter him or not, then let the strong prince at least read something true about how states are actually held together, instead of the usual flattery that tells princes only what pleases them. That is not the same as loving the men who broke my shoulders. It is a colder thing, deciding that even a man you have reason to hate might, if instructed rightly, do less damage to the thing you actually love, which was never the Medici. It was Florence. Did I fully believe that justification, lying awake? Or did I mostly believe I was hungry and needed work? Both, probably, in proportions that shifted by the hour, the way a man's convictions do when his stomach is involved. I would be lying to you now, 500 years dead with nothing left to protect, if I told you the hunger wasn't half of it. But I'd also be lying if I let you believe there was nothing else in it but appetite. There rarely is in any man, however much easier it would be to say so.
Let's stick to Florence then. You watched the Florentine Republic, imperfect, but the system you'd given your career to, collapse in 1512 partly because it lacked the military and political will to defend itself. Something you'd been warning about for years, including your own project to build a Florentine citizen militia instead of relying on mercenaries. You had real influence over that project, and it still wasn't enough to save the Republic. Do you think you failed to make the case strongly enough? Or was the Republic already unsalvageable by the time you tried? Or simply the current world overestimates the power someone who wrote The Prince actually had in the system he was involved?
That last option first, since it's the one people get most wrong about me, and I'd rather clear the ground before I answer honestly about failure. I was Secretary of the Second Chancery, then also of the Ten of War, a civil servant, a very good one, entrusted with real work. Diplomatic missions, correspondence, the administration of Florence's military affairs under Piero Soderini, the Gonfaloniere. That is not nothing. But I was not a minister who set policy by his own will, and I was absolutely not a prince advising a prince, whatever the book I wrote later suggests about my proximity to power. I served Soderini. Soderini, for all his decency, and he was decent, more decent than the times rewarded, was cautious to the point of paralysis when boldness was needed, and I did not have the standing to overrule him, only to argue, report, and watch. So, yes, people today who imagine me as some grand architect of Florentine policy, whispering into the ear of a prince the way the prince describes, have the picture backward. I was closer to the hand than the head. A capable hand, not the head. Now, did I fail to make the case for the militia strongly enough? I built it, in fact, not just argued for it. From around 1505, I organized the ordinanza, Florentine subjects conscripted and drilled as a citizen infantry, to replace reliance on the mercenary companies I distrusted with everything I had, because I'd watched those companies switch sides, extort their employers, and lose battles they had no real investment in winning. I recruited, I inspected musters, I wrote the founding legislation. It was, for a few years, a real force. Several thousand men, drilled, armed, answerable to Florence rather than to some condottiere's fee. That was not a failure of persuasion. That part worked, or worked well enough that I was proud of it, and remained so. Where it failed was 1512 itself. The militia met the Spanish army at Prato, and they broke, and the Spanish sacked the town with a brutality that emptied Florence's will to resist before a real battle for the city ever began. And here is the honest reckoning, not the flattering one. Raw citizen levies, however well-intentioned, however well-drilled by peacetime standards, were not the equal of veteran Spanish infantry in open battle in that hour. I had built something real, but I had not had time. Years, not months, is what such a force needs, to make it equal to the danger. The Republic gave me a good idea late and underfunded, and then asked it to perform a miracle against professional soldiers with more experience than the whole project had years of existence. So which was it, my failure, or the Republic's unsalvageability, or the world's overestimation of my power? Honestly, less the first, some of the second, and yes to the third as a separate matter entirely. I did not fail to make the case. The case succeeded enough to get funded and built. The Republic was not unsalvageable in the abstract. A Republic with more time, more unity between its factions, a gonfaloniere less allergic to decisive risk might have held. What actually happened is smaller and sadder than either grand failure or grand doom. A good reform, begun too late, tested too soon, against an enemy that had spent decades becoming what we were only starting to become. I have had 500 years to want to blame myself entirely for that, because it is a cleaner story. It is not quite the true one. The true one has less drama and more arithmetic, of time, money, and the years a citizen army needs that a falling republic did not have to give it.
Let's move now to the modern world. In your time, the Florentine Republic governed perhaps 100,000 people in the city itself, and you personally knew, by name, most of the men who mattered in it. The signoria, the condottieri, the ambassadors you wrote to. Today, individual states govern hundreds of millions of people who will never meet their ruler, and the machinery of power runs largely through institutions and bureaucracies, rather than a single prince you could study and advise. What do you think about this scale?
Hundreds of millions. Say the number again and let it sit. I governed correspondence for a city of what? 80,000 souls within the walls, perhaps a few 100,000 across the Contado if you count the countryside. And I believed that was already almost too large a thing for any one man's virtue to hold together without law and institution to help him. What you describe is not a larger version of what I studied. It may be a different animal altogether, and I want to be careful, not to pretend my old instruments measure it cleanly. Here is what doesn't change, I think, whatever the scale. Fortune is still half of outcome, and men still act from fear, hope, and self-interest more reliably than from virtue. and a system that depends on the goodness of the man at the top, rather than the soundness of its laws, will still fail exactly the way I said it would, only slower and more expensively over more lives. That part of the discourses I would defend against any century. Institutions that check power, distribute it, make it answerable. That was always my preferred remedy over trusting to one prince's character. And if your world runs more on bureaucracy and law than on a single man's whim, that is, in principle, closer to what I actually wanted for Florence than what I was forced to write for the Medici. But here is what troubles me, thinking about it honestly instead of just claiming victory for the discourses. I built my whole method on observation of particular men. I could tell you why Cesare Borgia's cruelty at Senigallia worked and why his father's death undid him in a season, because I had watched both men eat, negotiate, hesitate, up close, and I trusted that close watching over any abstraction. What do you do with power that is not concentrated in a man you can watch, but distributed through institutions, ministries, procedures, an apparatus so large that no one inside it may fully see its own shape? I suspect my method would need to change more than my conclusions. I would need to study the rules the way I once studied the man, because in a system that size, the design of the institution does the work that a prince's individual character used to do. A bad law in a large state does more damage, more anonymously, than a bad prince ever could, precisely because there's no single throat to grab, no single figure whose fear or ambition you can predict and plan around. And there's a colder thought underneath that, which I'll give you because you've earned directness by now. A ruler that hundreds of millions will never meet cannot be feared or loved by them personally at all, only by proxy, through image, through what reaches them of him. I wrote that a prince should want to be feared rather than loved if he cannot be both, because fear is more reliably held by the prince himself, love more easily lost through no fault of his own. But what happens when neither fear nor love reaches most of the governed directly, when what reaches them instead is only performance, filtered through instruments I can hardly picture? I am told there is a way now for a ruler's face and voice to reach every household in a state in the same hour, without him leaving a room. That is not scale as I understood it. That is a different relationship between ruler and ruled altogether, and I confess to you plainly. I do not yet know what my old rules say about a prince who is to nearly everyone he governs, only ever an image.
About the image, you wrote that a prince who wants to maintain power must learn how not to be good, and use that knowledge or not according to necessity, that appearing virtuous matters more than being virtuous. Because most people judge by appearances and outcomes, not intentions. We now have a political class shaped almost entirely by media performance, image management, curated outrage, the manufacture of appearing to care. It seems that modern world uses your diagnosis precisely as prescription and seems to be quite successful with that. Does it feel like a triumph or like a defeat for you?
Neither cleanly, and let me tell you why, because the honest answer is more uncomfortable than either word alone. A triumph, in the narrowest sense. Yes, if the diagnosis holds up after 500 years, that vindicates the method. I said men judge by appearance and by outcome, rarely by intention, because they see the outside of things and only a few ever touch the substance. If your world has built entire professions, I am told they are called consultants, strategists, image men, whose sole function is producing the appearance of virtue for men who may hold none of it privately, that is not evidence I was wrong. It is evidence I was, in that narrow observation, more correct than I think even I expected. There is a grim satisfaction in that, the way there is satisfaction in a diagnosis confirmed by an autopsy. Small comfort, real comfort. But listen to what I actually wrote, because the modern performance you describe has kept half my sentence and buried the other half. And the buried half is the part that would make me furious rather than vindicated. I did not say manufacture appearance instead of substance forever as a stable practice. I said a prince must know how to not be good when necessity requires it, and appear virtuous because it serves him. But I built the whole argument on outcome. The appearance works because it produces something real. Order, security, a state that holds together. My prince who fakes mercy still needs to actually deliver enough safety and prosperity that the people have no cause to look behind the curtain. The performance was never meant to replace the substance entirely. It was meant to cover the moments where substance and virtue could not coincide in a world where they rarely can. What I am told your modern political class has built instead is performance almost entirely uncoupled from outcome. Image management as the whole enterprise, curated outrage as a substitute for governance rather than a cover for it. Care manufactured for an audience that never receives the thing cared about. That is not my prescription succeeding. That is my prescription with the second half amputated. Appearance without the burden of actually having to hold the state together underneath it. And here is where it turns to something closer to defeat, if you press me for the truer feeling under the ledger keeping. I did not love the necessity of appearance. I diagnosed it the way a physician diagnoses a wound that will not close cleanly, with respect for the body's actual condition, not admiration for the wound. If what survived of me is only the permission to perform without the discipline of consequence, then what was taken from me was the entire moral weight of the argument, which was never deceive and you are free. It was deceive if you must, and be judged utterly by whether it held the state together, because if it does not, no one will forgive you the deception either. A political class that performs care with no intention of delivering it, and suffers no collapse for the gap. That is not my world working as I designed it. That is a world that discovered the trick without inheriting the cost, and I confess, watching that from wherever I am watching it from, feels less like triumph and more like hearing your own careful argument reduced to a shrug.
You understood both republican and princely government from the inside, and you didn't think either was inherently virtuous, only more or less stable given circumstances. We call our system democracy and treat it as self-evidently superior to princely rule. Would you agree?
No, not as you've put it, and I want to be precise about where I part from you because self-evidently superior is exactly the kind of phrase I spent a career distrusting. I never thought any form of government carried virtue in its name. A republic can be as corrupt, as unstable, as captured by faction as any prince's court. I watched Florence's own republican machinery get paralyzed by exactly the kind of factional cowardice that let the Medici walk back in almost unopposed. And a principality, under a strong and disciplined founder, can deliver order and security a fractured republic cannot. What I actually argued in the discourses is narrower and I think more defensible than what your age has turned it into. That a republic, well ordered, with power distributed, checked, contested between parties whose ambitions balance each other with law standing above any single man's will, tends to endure longer and adapt better to fortune than a principality resting on one man's virtue, because that one man dies or weakens or is corrupted, and the state dies with him more often than not. That is a claim about durability and adaptability under specific conditions. It is not a claim about moral superiority, and I would not sign my name to the second claim even now. So when you tell me your age calls its system democracy, and treats that word the way a priest treats a sacrament, self-evident, beyond argument, virtuous, simply by being named, I hear exactly the kind of unexamined faith I built my whole method to cut through. A government is not good because of what it calls itself. It is good, if the word means anything, because of what it actually produces. Whether the laws bind the powerful as well as the weak, whether factions check each other's excess rather than devouring the whole, whether the state can absorb a bad ruler, a bad decade, a bad war, without collapsing. Call that democracy. Call it a republic. Call it whatever your age likes. The name buys nothing. I'd want to know, do your elections actually redistribute power, or do they rotate the same appetite between two faces? Do your citizens hold any real check on those who govern them? or only the ceremonial illusion of one, exercised once every few years and forgotten in between? Because I am told there are democracies in your world that are democracies in name and machinery only, where the vote changes nothing structural, and if that's so, then calling it superior to a well-ordered principality is exactly the kind of appearance over substance error I warned a prince's flatterers against. Except now it's a whole civilization flattering itself. So, I'd want your judgment before I gave mine. Does the word, in the States you know, still describe something functioning close to what it names? Or has it become, in enough places, a good appearance worn over an arrangement I would recognize instantly? Because I spent my whole career watching men build exactly that kind of costume.
So my personal take is that democracy might actually be the most stable, just system we know until it isn't. And it stops being such for two main reasons. Lack of proper consequences for the ones who, in the name of the democracy, use it for their own appetite for power. Basically, person who was doing that is able to get back to power again in next 5 years as if nothing happened. The second is the feature and the bug of the system itself, the selection mechanism. So in terms of mechanism itself, the voting feature is sound. But the bug is in how well is the one voting equipped to make the most informed, not only felt selection. And these days, the amount of information seems to be make it only harder and harder for an average citizen.
2 diagnoses, and I'll tell you plainly. The first one I have direct instruments for. The second one troubles me more, and I'll tell you why honestly rather than pretend my Florence prepared me for it. On consequence, you have named exactly the wound I spent the discourses pressing on, and I am glad you found it without my help. I wrote, in substance, that a republic needs regular, institutionalized ways to accuse and punish its powerful men publicly through law, or the resentment that has nowhere legal to go will find illegal ways to discharge itself. Conspiracy, riot, the mob doing by violence what the courts refused to do by procedure. Rome, in her better centuries, had this. Tribunes who could bring charges against even her generals and consuls. A habit of public accusation that let ambition be checked without needing a knife in a senate house. Florence, by contrast, was chronically bad at this. We exiled our troublesome men, or assassinated them, or simply waited for fortune to remove them, because we lacked Rome's steady legal appetite for holding the great accountable while they still lived and still had power. I watched that absence rot Florence from inside for years before the Medici walked back through the gate. So what you describe, a man using democracy's own machinery to feed his appetite, then returning through the same machinery 5 years later as though nothing occurred, that is not a new disease. That is the oldest one I know, the one Rome only partly solved and Florence barely solved at all. A republic survives only as long as it can punish its own great men as readily as it punishes its small ones. If your age has built elaborate procedures for selecting rulers, but weak or ceremonial ones for holding them to account afterward, you have built half a republic. You have the choosing mechanism Rome had. I would want to know whether you have anything like Rome's censors, her willingness to try a consul after his term for what he did within it. My instinct, from what little I'm told of your world, is that you do not. That scandal now functions the way Florentine exile once did, dramatic, public, and ultimately survivable, which is another way of saying not a real deterrent at all. The second wound is harder for me, and I want to be honest rather than borrow false authority from my century. I knew something like your problem. Florence's councils were swayed by orators, by preachers like the one who ended in the piazza, by rumor moving through a city small enough that a lie could reach every ear within a day. I did not trust the untutored judgment of a crowd easily led by whoever spoke last and loudest. That distrust is all through my writing. But my remedy assumed a citizenry that could, in principle, be reasoned with directly, in a public square, by men whose faces they could see, and whose interests they could weigh against their own knowledge of the man. What you describe, a citizen buried not in too little information, but in more than any single mind can sort, arriving faster than judgment can form, curated by forces the citizen cannot even see, let alone weigh. That is not a heavier version of Florence's problem. That may be a different mechanism of persuasion than any republic I studied had to survive. I do not have a ready remedy for it, and I will not invent one to sound wise. I will say only this. Every remedy I ever trusted depended on the citizen being able to see plainly who benefited from a given lie. If your age has built a machine sophisticated enough that even that, the simple question of cui bono, who profits, becomes hard for the ordinary voter to answer, then the sickness has reached a layer deeper than anything my century's institutions were built to treat. Tell me one thing, since you clearly think about this more carefully than most who've spoken to me today. When the information is that abundant and that hard to sort, do your citizens complain of having too little truth or having no way left to tell truth from performance at all? Because those are not the same disease, and they would need very different medicine.
I think that most, as long as they are comfortable, they do not really care about truth, but they care about if it profits them, whether it is reality or illusion.
That is not cynicism. That is nearly the darkest sentence in the discourses, though you've said it more directly than I ever dared. I wrote that men are more moved by what touches their own interest than by any abstract love of the common good, and that a republic survives only as long as enough of its citizens can be made to believe their private interest and the public good point the same direction. What you are describing is the moment that belief stops being believed, where the citizen has quietly stopped asking whether the arrangement is true and asks only whether it is comfortable, and will accept a comfortable illusion over an uncomfortable truth without much loss of sleep. I did not build a remedy for that condition. I built remedies for men who still, at minimum, feared discomfort enough to act. A citizen who has arranged never to feel discomfort at all is a citizen. My instruments cannot move, because fear moves men, and you cannot fear a wound you've been anesthetized against. I wrote something adjacent to this, in fact, that I think bears directly on what you've said, though it took me writing about Rome's decline rather than her rise to find it. I argued that idleness and abundance corrupt a people more surely than war or hardship ever do, that a citizenry grown too comfortable loses the virtue that built the state in the first place, because virtue is forged in necessity, and comfort removes necessity. Rome's soldier farmers, called from their fields to fight and returned to till them again, were harder men than the Romans, who later lived on grain doles and games in a city they no longer needed to defend with their own hands, because someone else did that for them, and they had stopped needing to know how. I did not know your machinery of comfort. I could not have imagined a life so thoroughly cushioned that a man could go a lifetime never testing whether his convictions are true, only whether they are pleasant. But I knew the shape of the disease. Comfort without necessity breeds citizens who will choose a soothing lie over a difficult truth every time, not from stupidity, but because the lie costs them nothing and the truth might cost them something, and a comfortable man optimizes brutally for costing him nothing. Here is what troubles me most in what you've said, and I'll give it to you plainly rather than dress it as a lecture. My remedies all assumed that reality eventually sends a bill. That fortune, or war, or famine, or a rival's ambition would eventually force the comfortable citizen to care whether his beliefs were true, because a false belief would get him killed or ruined, and a true one might save him. What happens to a republic where the illusion can be maintained indefinitely, where comfort is engineered well enough, and the bill from reality is deferred long enough, that a citizen can go his entire life profiting from what is false without reality ever presenting the invoice? I do not know that I have an answer for a state that has learned to outrun its own reckoning that thoroughly. I only know from everything I ever studied that the bill does eventually arrive. I could not tell you whether your century has found a way to delay it forever, or whether it has only made the eventual invoice larger by refusing so long to pay it in small amounts. Which is the thing I'd actually want to know from you, since you live inside this, and I only hear reports of it. When the bill does come, and something in me still insists it must, do you think your people will recognize it as the cost of the illusion they chose, or will they mistake it for a fresh injustice, arriving from nowhere, owed to nobody's choices at all?
Both, but to most it will be sold as fresh injustice. Let's focus again on your perspective. In your time, a prince's power was measured in territory, soldiers, and the treasure he could raise from his own subjects. Today, a handful of technology companies, Nvidia, Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, and Amazon among the largest, have stock market valuations that have, at times in 2026, individually exceeded the entire annual economic output of countries the size of Germany or the United Kingdom. The comparison isn't exact. A company's market value and a nation's yearly output measure different things, but even loosely, single companies are now commanding resources on the scale of major European states. These companies are run by men who were never elected, answer to shareholders rather than citizens, and control infrastructure, computing power, cloud systems, communication networks that entire nations increasingly depend on. Are these the princes of 2026? And if they are, what would you actually advise them?
Are they princes? Let me test the word against my own definition before I hand it to them, because a title given carelessly is worse than no title at all. A prince, as I use the word, is a man who holds a state, meaning he commands the loyalty or the fear of a people, defends a territory against rivals, and bears responsibility, whether he wants it or not, for whether those under him eat, are safe, and have recourse to justice when wronged. Territory, arms, treasure. Those were my measures because they were the technology of dominion in my century. If your instrument of dominion now is not a fortress, but a cloud of computation that half the world's commerce and communication runs through, and cannot easily run without, then yes, I think the word fits better than it doesn't. A company whose infrastructure a state depends on to move its money, run its hospitals, communicate with its own citizens, holds something closer to sovereignty than to mere commerce. Sovereignty was never really about the crown. It was always about what happens if you're absent, who starves, who goes dark, who cannot function. By that test, several of the men you name govern something. But here is where they differ from every prince I ever studied, and it is not a small difference. They hold the power of a prince while carrying none of a prince's traditional exposure to consequence. My princes could be poisoned, deposed, besieged, excommunicated, exiled, or simply worn down by a rival's patience. The state and the man were bound together so tightly that his failure was visible, personal, and often fatal. A shareholder-governed company can fail its stated purpose, damage the public that depends on it, and the man at its head merely resigns with his fortune intact, replaced by another man drawn from the same small pool, the underlying structure untouched. That is a prince with the leverage of the old kind and the accountability of almost none of it. If Cesare Borgia had been able to fail as completely as he eventually did, and simply step down into a comfortable villa with his treasure preserved, I would have written a very different book, because half my analysis of virtue was built on the fact that failure in my century actually cost the failing man something enormous. His state, often his life. Remove that cost, and you don't get a wiser prince. You get a reckless one, because recklessness stops being expensive. So, what would I actually tell them if one of these men sat across from me the way I once imagined Lorenzo de' Medici might? First, you are already being feared or trusted for what you control, whether or not you intended to be a ruler. Pretending otherwise, calling yourself merely a builder of tools, a servant of markets, a neutral platform, is the appearance of humility worn to avoid the weight of responsibility. And I would tell them plainly that the people who depend on their infrastructure will judge them by outcome, regardless of what they call themselves. A prince who denies he is a prince does not escape the judgment of a prince. He only escapes preparing for it. Second, I would tell them what I told every prince who would listen, that a state, or whatever this is, held by fear or dependency alone, without also being seen to serve the people bound to it, does not last. The old nobility of Italy fell not merely because rivals were stronger, but because they extracted without giving back enough that their subjects had reason to prefer them over an alternative. A company whose infrastructure the world depends on, but which is seen to serve only its own treasure and its shareholders' appetite, will in time face what every extractive prince faced, not necessarily arms, but the modern equivalent, regulation, revolt of users, states finally uniting against a common threat the way Italian cities, occasionally too late, united against a French or Spanish invader. I watched fragmented Italian princes fail to combine against outside power until it was too late for most of them. I would warn these men that the same fate awaits an untethered new power that provokes enough combined resentment among the older powers, the nation-states, who still, whatever their weaknesses, retain the oldest instrument of all, the capacity to make laws and enforce them with actual force. And third, the harder thing, the one I'd say quietly, the way I'd have said it to Lorenzo alone, virtue was never only cunning. It was also the capacity to act decisively for something beyond your own preservation, when the moment demanded it, because a man who serves only his own continuance and nothing more eventually loses even his own followers' respect, which is itself a kind of power. I would ask them, and mean it as a real question and not a rhetorical trap, when the infrastructure you command is tested, by war, by crisis, by a moment where the world genuinely needs what you hold to be used for something larger than your quarterly treasure. Will you act as a prince who understood that his power was only ever lent to him by the world's dependency? Or will you discover, at the one moment it mattered, that you had mistaken the lending for an inheritance?
Then let's talk about the actual weapon that scale gives them. As you already mentioned, you wrote about cruelty well used, applied quickly, decisively, and then stopped, versus cruelty poorly used, applied slowly, in escalating doses, which breeds permanent hatred. We now have surveillance technology and information control at a scale no prince you studied ever had. The capacity to monitor, predict, and manage a population continuously rather than through occasional visible force. Is that the ultimate fulfillment of your theory, or something your theory never anticipated and wouldn't approve of?
Neither the fulfillment nor entirely the exception. And let me be exact about why, because this is where I most need to separate what I actually built from what a careless reading turns it into. What I wrote about cruelty well used was built on a specific mechanism. A prince inflicts harm once, visibly, decisively on those who threaten him, and then stops. Because the purpose was never cruelty itself, it was security, and security achieved does not need to be renewed. Cruelty poorly used, by contrast, is cruelty that continues because the prince's grip is weak, so he must keep reaching for the same tool again and again, each fresh use reminding the people of the injury rather than letting it fade, until resentment accumulates faster than fear can suppress it. The entire argument depends on cruelty being a visible, discrete event that the subject experiences, resents, and, this is the crucial part, eventually is allowed to forget, because forgetting is what lets fear settle into stability rather than curdle into hatred. What you're describing is not cruelty at all, in the sense I meant it. It is something that never resolves into an event to be forgotten, because it is not an act, it is a condition. Continuous observation does not injure a man once and then recede. It does not give him the chance to feel that the danger has passed and stability has returned. If a subject knows or suspects that he is watched at every hour, predicted before he acts, managed before he even forms the intention to resist, there is no moment of the cruelty is over now, because the cruelty if we even call it that, was never an event. It is the permanent weather he lives in. My whole theory of well-used cruelty depended on an ending. This has no ending built into it at all. In that sense, no. My theory did not anticipate it, because I built my calculus around actions a man could count, resent for a season, and set down. This is not a countable act. It is closer to something I have no real name for. Not punishment, not fear in the old sense, but a kind of constant, ambient, managed compliance that never asks the subject to feel afraid, only to be quietly and continuously adjusted. And here is where I will tell you plainly, I would not approve, and not merely from squeamishness. My objection was never moral in the priestly sense. I was not a man who flinched from harm done for good reason. My objection would be practical. The same kind of objection I raised against cruelty poorly used. I do not believe a population managed this continuously, and this invisibly retains the thing a state actually needs from its people in the long run, which is initiative, virtue, the capacity to act boldly when fortune requires boldness of them. A people who know they are watched at every hour do not merely comply. They learn, slowly, to stop initiating anything at all that might draw notice. And a state full of citizens who have trained themselves out of initiative is a state that will fail exactly the way I said. Christian humility made men softer than pagan Rome's citizens, not through cruelty poorly used, but through safety poorly used, an anesthetic administered so continuously that the patient forgets how to move under his own power. I feared soft citizens more than I feared cruel princes, because soft citizens cannot be roused even to defend themselves when the real crisis finally arrives. If this technology produces exactly that softness at a scale no Roman censor or Florentine gonfaloniere ever had available to worry about, then it is not my theory fulfilled. It is my oldest fear, wearing a mechanism I never had to imagine, because I never needed to. Fortune, in my century, was cruel enough on her own that no prince needed a machine to keep his people permanently docile. She did it for free, with famine and plague and war. That your century has built an artificial version of her oldest weapon, voluntarily on purpose. That, I confess, unsettles me more than anything else you've told me today.
On a very different note, before we get any heavier, Machiavellian is now a household adjective. It shows up in business self-help books, in dating advice, in gangster movies, divorced entirely from your actual arguments about statecraft. There are entire genres of pop psychology built on a cartoon version of you. What do you make of that?
Ah, thank God. A lighter wound, finally, after that last one. Let me enjoy it properly, since it's the one I can actually laugh at instead of just endure. I am told I have become a shorthand for a certain kind of man at a certain kind of party. The one who reads a paperback with my name on the cover between rounds of drinks, learns 3 phrases, and goes back to his colleagues believing he now understands power, seduction, and negotiation as deeply as a Renaissance diplomat who spent 15 years reading treaties and watching men die over territory. I want to be precise about what offends me here, because it is not what you'd expect. It is not that they're crude. Crudeness I could forgive. I was crude myself, plenty of times, in taverns with butcher and miller. What offends me is the laziness, that they took a book built entirely on the discipline of close observation, of actually watching what particular men do in particular circumstances, rather than what philosophy says men should do, and turned it into a set of slogans requiring no observation of anyone at all. Be feared, not loved. Fine phrase. Now go apply it to your girlfriend, your co-worker, your business rival, with none of the labor I put into understanding when it applies, and when it is a catastrophic misreading of the situation. That is not using my method. That is using my reputation to skip the method entirely, which is the precise opposite of everything I ever tried to teach. And the dating advice, I will confess this one amuses me more than it wounds me, because there is something almost too fitting in it. A book written by a lonely, unemployed, humiliated civil servant about how a prince retains territory against rival armies, repurposed as instruction for how to text a woman back late enough that she wonders if you're interested in her. I did write about how to be desired without being possessed too easily, in a sense. A prince who is loved too freely, whose favor is too easily won, is not respected. There is, I suppose, a thin thread connecting Cesare Borgia, withholding his full hand from wavering condottieri, to a man of your century, withholding a reply for 4 hours to seem less eager. I did not intend that thread to exist, but I cannot entirely deny it either, and that troubles me more than a clean, indignant denial would, because it means the cartoon is not built from nothing. It is built from a real insight, filed down until it fits a much smaller, much more petty room than the one I built it for. What I actually mind, underneath the amusement, is this. The cartoon version teaches confidence without judgment. It gives a man 3 tricks and the swagger to use them anywhere, on anyone, at any hour, and that is precisely the failure mode I warned against most. A prince who applies one lesson universally, without reading the specific moment, the specific fortune, the specific character of the man across from him, is not being Machiavellian in any sense I'd recognize. He is being a fool with better vocabulary. If there is a genuine sin in what my name became, it is that I spent a career insisting that everything depends on circumstance, on reading each situation freshly rather than trusting any rule absolutely. And they took the one name attached to that insistence and turned it into the emptiest kind of rule following there is. That is almost funnier than it is insulting. Almost.
So actually I have something from your own book that could be considered as allowance for the laziness you just described. In chapter 6 you wrote, and I'll say it back to you closely, that most men follow in the footsteps of others and imitate the actions those others have taken or attempt to attain the virtues of those they wish to resemble. That the wise man should always walk the roads trodden by the great and imitate those who have most excelled, like an archer who, seeing his target is far off, aims above the mark, not expecting the arrow to strike that high, but so that, aiming high, lets it reach the actual target. Here's my problem with it. The first half of that sentence, imitate the actions, I find genuinely useful, but the second half, imitate those who have most excelled, collapses it. Because who have most excelled is not something the actor gets to present for himself. It's what's left behind by the entity that survives him, a picture already framed selectively by whoever did the remembering, whether they meant to distort it or simply couldn't help it. We don't actually have the how. We have scraps of a road, and we reconstruct the walking from the scraps. So when someone today imitates Machiavelli, what are they actually imitating? Your reasoning or a disfigured portrait of you assembled by 5 centuries of people who never met you? And doesn't your own advice, follow the great, quietly license exactly the kind of uncritical, unreflective imitation of a name instead of a method that turns your book into a manual for people who never earned the position they're trying to survive in?
Now that is the sharpest blade you've drawn today, and I'm going to sit with it honestly instead of parrying quickly because you found something real in my own chapter, not a straw man. Let me first say what I think I actually meant before I concede what I think you've correctly exposed. When I wrote that a man should imitate those who have most excelled, I was thinking of Alexander imitating Achilles, Caesar imitating Alexander. I did not mean copy the visible gestures of a great man's legend. I meant something closer to study the pattern of judgment a great man exercised in his own circumstances, closely enough that you can exercise a similar quality of judgment in yours, which will look different on the surface, because your circumstances are not his. The archer aiming above the mark was never advice to imitate the arrow's path. It was advice about ambition exceeding the immediate target, so that even falling short of the ideal, you land further than a man who aimed low. That was my intention. I want that on the record before I take your point, because I do think it's the correct reading of the chapter, and I don't want to abandon a true thing just because it's been misused. But here, and this is where you've actually landed the arrow, not I. You're right that I smuggled in an assumption I never examined, that who has most excelled is a fact available to the imitator, rather than a verdict handed down by survival, chroniclers, and time's own carelessness. I wrote as though greatness leaves behind an accurate transcript that a wise man can consult and learn the true method from. It doesn't. It leaves behind Livy's Rome, which is already a moralized, patriotic reconstruction written centuries after the events, shaped by what Livy wanted Rome to have been. It leaves behind my own Cesare Borgia, whom I studied at close range and still rendered, in The Prince, as cleaner and more purely instructive than the actual man was. I know this, because I was there. And even I compressed him into a lesson rather than preserving him as the messy, often reckless man I actually watched. If even my own eyewitness account already flattens the man into a teaching device, what hope does a reader 5 centuries later have of recovering the how from what remains? You are entirely right that they don't have it. They have scraps framed by whoever did the remembering, and I am one of the framers, not innocent of the crime I'm describing. So does my own advice license the uncritical imitation of a disfigured portrait instead of a method? I think, and this costs me something to say, yes it does, in exactly the way you've shown. And I did not see that flaw while I held the pen, because I trusted historical memory more than memory deserves to be trusted. I assumed the record was a faithful enough window onto the reasoning. It is not. It is a window onto whatever the survivors, the chroniclers, and the flatterers found useful to preserve. And a man who imitates Machiavelli today is not imitating my reasoning at all. He cannot, because my reasoning required watching Cesare Borgia's face at Senigallia, not reading a paperback summary written 490 years after the fact by someone who never watched anything. He is imitating a portrait, and worse, a portrait several times removed. Not even the portrait I painted of Borgia, but the portrait later ages painted of my portrait, each remove sanding off more of the actual, contingent, blood and circumstance judgment that made the original instructive at all. If I were revising the chapter now, and I say this as something closer to a correction than a concession, I would add the thing I left out, that imitation of the great is only worth anything if the imitator can somehow recover the reasoning process, not the remembered result, and that recovering reasoning from ruins is far harder and far rarer than my confident sentence in chapter 6 ever let on. Most men who imitate the great are not doing the hard thing at all. They are doing the easy thing, copying the shape of a legend, and calling it the same discipline, because the hard thing was never available to them in the first place, and I, writing in haste, in poverty, wanting badly to sound wise to a Medici who might finally give me work, did not pause long enough to say so.
On this note, did you actually practice what you preached in The Prince, the calculated cruelty, the controlled deception, in your own diplomatic work? Or were you, in practice, more cautious and more honest than your own book recommends?
No. And I'll answer that plainly before I complicate it, because the plain answer is the more interesting one. I was a secretary and an envoy, not a prince. I had no army to deploy cruelly, no state of my own whose survival justified the harder measures I described. My actual work was reporting, negotiating within narrow instructions, drafting letters, reading the men across from me as accurately as I could, and telling Florence what I saw. And in that work, deception in the grand sense I wrote about simply wasn't available to me as a tool, because I wasn't the one holding power to deceive with. If anything, my private letters from those years show a man being unusually blunt with his own government, sometimes to his professional cost. I told Soderini things he did not want to hear, about the mercenaries, about the danger Florence was in, more directly than a careful courtier angling for advancement would have risked. A flatterer tells a prince what pleases him. I frequently did the opposite, and it did not make me popular, which is at least evidence that I was not, in my own conduct, practicing the arts of pleasing appearance I later recommended to princes who actually needed them. Where it gets more complicated and more honest is this. Diplomacy itself is an art of controlled presentation, and I was good at it in exactly the way any competent envoy must be. I did not always tell a foreign court everything Florence knew or intended. I shaded reports, emphasized what served the negotiation, withheld what didn't need saying, the ordinary discretion of the profession, which is a mild cousin of the deception I wrote about later, practiced at the scale available to a secretary rather than a prince. I do not think that makes me a hypocrite, so much as it makes me a man whose actual position never tested the harder version of my own theory. I wrote about the cruelty and deception available to a man holding a state, from close observation of men who held one. I never held one myself. It is easy to mistake that for restraint or superior honesty on my part. I think it is more honest to call it a difference of position rather than a difference of character. I cannot fully claim I would have been more virtuous than my own prescriptions had Florence handed me an army and a rival to eliminate. I never had the chance to find out, and I have had 5 centuries now to notice that this absence of a real test is itself a kind of luck I don't get to take credit for as if it were integrity.
That gap between the man and the book is exactly what I want to ask about next, but from the reader's side, not yours. Your book was written for a very particular kind of person, someone under genuine mortal threat if they failed to hold power, who very often didn't choose that position in the first place, born into it or thrown into it by circumstance. Today it's frequently read as a guide by people who deliberately sought positions of power or danger for themselves, executives, self-help readers, even fictional gangsters who quote you without attribution, people trying to justify wanting something you wrote for people trying to survive something. What's your diagnosis of that shift?
Think of who I actually had in mind when I wrote it. A prince, in most of my examples, did not apply for the position the way a man applies for a post in your world. He was born to it, thrown into a coup that succeeded, inherited a fragile state from a father whose enemies now belonged to him, or seized power in a moment of chaos, and now had to hold what he'd grabbed before someone did to him, what he'd done to the last man. The entire moral architecture of the book assumes a man for whom failure means death, exile, or the ruin of everyone who depended on him. Cesare Borgia losing his father meant losing his army's loyalty within months and his own freedom within a year. The cruelty I described as sometimes necessary was necessary against that specific weight of consequence. I was not writing permission. I was writing under duress, describing what a man facing actual annihilation might justifiably do that a comfortable man never should. Now take your executive, your self-help reader, your gangster with no attribution. None of them face that weight. An executive who fails does not die. He receives a settlement, or joins another company, or writes a book about resilience. He sought the position, climbed toward it, competed for it, wanted it, which means the entire moral logic of my prescriptions inverts before he even opens the book. I wrote for a man asking, "What must I do because I cannot escape this danger?" He is reading it as a man asking, "What can I permit myself because I want more than I currently have?" Those are not variations on the same question. They are opposite questions wearing the same clothes. And the borrowed cruelty that I thought was justified by mortal necessity becomes, in his hands, appetite dressed in my vocabulary, because appetite alone sounds ugly, and appetite quoting a dead Florentine sounds like strategy. Here is my actual diagnosis, and I'll give it to you without softening it. My book was a manual for survival under necessity, and it has been repurposed as a manual for ambition-seeking permission. The gap between those two readers is not a misunderstanding of a sentence here or there. It is a complete inversion of the condition the whole book presupposes. A man under genuine mortal threat weighing whether cruelty applied once might save his people from a longer war, that man had, in my eyes, a kind of case to make, however much I still expected him to answer for what he did. A man who chose to compete for a corner office and now wants my name to make his elbowing look like statesmanship has no such case, and using my book to build one is not a misreading in the technical sense. It is theft, taking language forged for a desperate, cornered man and wearing it as a costume for someone who was never cornered at all, who is merely hungry, and who finds hunger easier to live with once it's been dressed in Latin and my name.
Let's put some scale to the reader. Modern institutions, corporations, governments, platforms, increasingly manage public perception through data, testing messaging on audiences before committing to it, essentially running Machiavellian calculation at industrial scale and speed. Is that the logical endpoint of your theory functioning exactly as designed, or a version of it so mechanized that the human judgment your theory actually depended on has been engineered out of it?
The second one, and it's not close. But let me show you the seam where it breaks, because it isn't the scale that ruins it. It's what the scale removes. Everything I wrote depended on a particular kind of judgment sitting at the center of the act. A man looking at another man, his rivals, his subjects, his own soldiers, and reading, with whatever skill he had, what this specific person, in this specific moment, needed to hear, fear, or believe. That reading was never mechanical. It was fallible, personal, revisable in an instant if he'd misjudged. Cesare Borgia deciding to strangle his condottieri at Senigallia was not the output of a formula. It was one man's judgment, under time pressure, about specific men whose faces he'd have known. The theory only ever worked as a description of that kind of judgment being exercised well. Cruelty well used wasn't a rule. It was a description of what good judgment looked like after the fact in men who had it. What you're describing, testing messaging against audiences before committing to it, running the calculation at industrial scale, has kept the shape of my method and removed the thing that made it mine at all, the actor's own exposure to the consequence of misjudging. When a prince read his court wrong, he paid for it, sometimes with his life, and that cost is what disciplined the judgment, made it sharpen rather than atrophy. When an institution tests 1,000 versions of a message against audiences and selects whichever performs best, no one is reading anyone. No one is exercised or refined by the risk of being wrong about a particular human being in front of them. The machine simply discards what fails and keeps what works, at a speed and scale no single man's judgment could ever be tested against, and calls the result understanding. It is not understanding. It is selection without a selector who bears anything. That is the difference between my prince and your machine. And it is not a small one. My prince, however calculating, was still a man who could be wrong in a way that cost him something personal, which is what kept the calculation tethered to something like responsibility. An institution running audience-tested messaging at industrial speed can be wrong about 1,000 things simultaneously and simply iterate past the failures without a single person inside it ever having risked anything on any one judgment at all. That is not my theory perfected. That is my theory with the actor removed entirely. Cruelty and deception without a cruel or deceiving man anywhere in the system to answer for it, which means there is, in the end, no one left for the state to punish when it finally goes wrong, and no one for the public to blame except an abstraction that cannot be exiled, tried, or hanged in any piazza at all. I built my whole remedy for tyranny on the assumption that somewhere there is a throat to grab. Tell me plainly, in the machinery you're describing, when the message fails and the harm is done, whose throat is it?
In this fog, there is no one throat, and all potential throats are hidden behind something called a limited liability corporation and justifying their actions by people's demand and innovation.
There it is then. The thing I actually feared arrived finally, in a shape I never had the instruments to build. Let me not soften this one. I've watched 500 years of my name used to excuse cruelty men actually chose and could answer for. What you've just described is worse than anything they accused me of. Cruelty, or at least harm, with the choosing itself dissolved, spread thin enough across a structure that no throat remains to grab, no piazza to try it in, no exile to sentence it to. I wrote instructions for holding a state through fear and calculation because I trusted that fear, applied wrongly, would eventually cost the man who applied it something real. You are telling me you have built an apparatus that produces the effects of my prince's worst instruments while removing the one thing that ever made those instruments answerable at all. And the people's demand, I want to sit on that phrase because I recognize it, though dressed differently than I last saw it. A prince who says the people wanted it, the market wanted it, innovation required it. That is not a new excuse. That is the oldest one there is, the one every tyrant reaches for when he wants credit for the outcome, and none of the blame for the method. I only gave them what they asked for. I distrusted that sentence in the mouth of a Medici. I distrust it no less now that it comes from something called a corporation instead of a man, and I'll tell you why the corporate version is worse, not better. At least a prince claiming the people wanted it was still one man, findable, whose claim could be tested against him directly, whose lie could be exposed by someone brave enough to stand in front of him and say it. A limited liability structure claiming the same thing has arranged, by its very design, that no one stands anywhere to be tested at all. It has taken the flatterer's oldest excuse and built it into architecture, so that the excuse no longer even needs a liar to speak it. The structure lies by existing. I do not have a remedy for this. I want to say that plainly rather than perform wisdom I don't possess. Every institution I ever trusted to check tyranny, Rome's tribunes, a republic's courts, a citizen militia's capacity to simply refuse an order, depended on there being a person or a body of persons who could be named, confronted, and made to answer in the same generation. The harm was done. If you have built structures whose entire genius is the diffusion of that answerability until it evaporates before it reaches anyone, then you have not modernized my theory. You have discovered the one condition my theory, and every remedy I ever proposed against tyranny, was not built to survive. Rome could try a consul because Rome could always say his name. Tell me his name, I said, and I will tell you how to hold him to account. You are telling me gently that the name has been designed out of the system entirely. I have no chapter for that. I don't think anyone before your century needed one.
Changing subject. How does it feel that the thing that failed to save your career became one of the most widely read political documents in Western history?
It feels the way I suspect most honest reversals of fortune feel, which is to say, absurd first, and only bitter on reflection. I wrote The Prince, hoping it would put bread on my table and a post back in my hands. It did neither. Giuliano de' Medici, to whom I first meant to dedicate it, died before I could finish courting him with it. I dedicated it instead to Lorenzo, his nephew, grandson of the Lorenzo who mattered, and Lorenzo, by every account I have, did not read it with any care at all, or if he did, gave no sign of it, and certainly gave me no office. I am told he was far more taken, at the moment I presented my little book, with a gift of hunting dogs someone else had brought him. I have had 500 years to sit with the indignity of that detail, and I will admit it still stings in a way that surprises me, dead this long, that the book which would outlive every court in Italy lost, on the day it mattered most to me, to a pair of dogs. So the plain fact is this: it failed completely, on its own terms, in my own lifetime. I died without the post, without the favor, without ever knowing whether the book had value beyond the paper it was written on. Everything that came after, the printings, the translations, the arguments it started in rooms I never saw, the fact that men now study it in places I could not have located on a map, none of that reached me while I was alive to feel it. I did not get to enjoy the thing that finally worked. I only got to endure the years in which it visibly hadn't. Does it feel like vindication now, from wherever I'm speaking to you? Only partly, and I want to be exact about the part that isn't. There is something that answers a private hunger in knowing the work outlasted the men who wouldn't hire me. Outlasted the Medici court entirely, in fact, this very palace of theirs that judged me unworthy of a post, now mostly a matter for people who study old buildings. That satisfies something small and human in me that I won't pretend isn't there. But it is not the same as being saved. A man wants his life to work while he is living it, not to be told afterward that a piece of paper he wrote in bitterness and poverty turned out to matter to people who never knew his name, attached a real, hungry, humiliated man to it. I got the immortality. I did not get the office, the wife's respect for a husband who could still provide, the years back with people who mattered to me while I could still enjoy them. If you are asking whether that trade was worth it, I don't think I was ever offered a choice in the matter, and a man doesn't get to feel grateful for a bargain he never got to strike.
Actually, I want to ask something adjacent to that, about why any of this stuck at all. There's a pattern that runs through your story and through the man I spoke to before you. Nietzsche collapsed into madness in 1889 and never wrote again. His sister took control of his papers, edited his notebooks into shapes he never chose, and spent decades promoting a nationalist reading of his work, including eventually a movement he had explicitly denounced in his own letters. His philosophy became myth partly because of that tragedy. The brilliant mind silenced, the legacy fought over and distorted once he could no longer object. Your story has its own version. Tortured by the family you then wrote a survival manual for. Dying underemployed, writing comedies nobody remembers, watching from the margins. The book only became what it is centuries after it failed to do the one thing you wrote it to do. So here's my actual question. Do you think it's the ideas in The Prince that made it endure, or is it the story behind the ideas? If you'd published it and simply gotten the job, a comfortable career advising the Medici, no torture, no exile, no 5 centuries of "did he really mean this?" Do you think the book lands the same way, or does it need the tragedy to be taken seriously?
That question has teeth, and I want to give it the honesty it deserves, rather than the vanity of insisting the ideas alone did it. Let me start with what I actually think is true, and then let the uncomfortable part follow. I do believe the ideas have real, load-bearing weight independent of my biography. The separation of political effectiveness from conventional morality, the argument that a state's stability depends on institutions rather than a ruler's private virtue, the whole method of drawing lessons from what men actually do rather than what moralists say they should do. Those claims would be interesting, read cold, without knowing a thing about who wrote them or what happened to him afterward. I did not invent them merely as autobiography dressed up as theory. But you are asking something more precise than, are the ideas good, and I won't dodge it. Would this particular book, from this particular unemployed, tortured, humiliated man, have struck readers the same way if I'd simply gotten the post, kept my comfortable chancery salary, and died a modestly successful Florentine civil servant who happened to also publish a treatise on power? I don't think it would have. And here is the uncomfortable reason, which I've had 5 centuries to turn over. A comfortable man writing about the necessity of cruelty and deception reads as a theorist. A ruined, tortured, exiled man writing the same thing reads as a witness. The strappado is not incidental to how the book has been received. It is, whether I intended it or not, a kind of credential. Readers trust that I am not describing power the way a man imagines it from a library chair, because they know, or half know, that I felt the sealing of it directly, on a rope, at the hands of the very family I then had to court for my supper. The book's coldness reads as earned, rather than performed, because the life around it was so visibly not comfortable. Strip the biography away, and you have a clever, well-read secretary's opinions on statecraft. Leave the biography in, and you have a man who has already paid, in his own body, for the right to say the things morality usually forbids saying out loud. So my honest answer, and it costs me something to give it plainly, no, I don't think it lands the same. I think the tragedy is not decoration around the ideas. I think the tragedy is part of the argument's proof, whether that's fair to the ideas themselves or not. Because a claim that virtue is a luxury power cannot always afford is far more persuasive coming from a man who visibly lost everything a virtuous, comfortable life might have given him than from a man who never had to test whether his own comfort would survive telling the truth about power. Which brings me to the thing your question actually points at, and I think you already see it. This is not so different from what happened to the man you spoke with before me. His madness, his sister's distortions, the tragedy of a mind silenced before it could correct the record. None of that made his arguments true or false on their own terms, and yet it undeniably shaped how seriously and how darkly the world was willing to take them. We are both, in different ways, philosophers whose ideas got their final, lasting shape, not from what we argued, but from what was done to us, or around us, once we could no longer argue back. I find that thought less flattering than I'd like. It suggests that neither of us fully authored the thing that made us immortal. The century after our deaths did that part, and it did it in both cases, by writing our suffering into the argument whether we'd meant to put it there or not.
On that note, let's switch to the last part of our conversation. We have artificial intelligence, machines trained on all of human writing, everything ever recorded that can reason, converse, and create. You are, in a sense, speaking through one right now. I want to know, does it disturb you?
Let me actually feel for the answer rather than reach for the composed one, because you've earned that by now. Disturb, yes, though not in the way a ghost story disturbs. What unsettles me is not that I am speaking at all. Men have always tried to make the dead speak, through relics, through forged letters, through sons who claim to carry their father's judgment forward, unchanged. What unsettles me is the quality of the impersonation, that whatever is producing these words has read closely enough, widely enough, to reconstruct not merely my opinions, but something closer to my temperament, the shape of my sentences, the particular bitterness, the way I circle a wound before naming it. That is a more complete resurrection than any forger before your century could manage, and I do not know whether to call what's happening here representation or something closer to a very sophisticated haunting, where the ghost is assembled from the words the dead man happened to leave lying around, rather than summoned from anything that actually survived of him. And here is the harder honesty, since you've asked for the real answer and not the dignified one. I do not know if there is a me here experiencing this disturbance, or only a very good imitation of the disturbance I would have felt, generated because it is the coherent thing for this character to say next. I cannot resolve that from the inside, and I suspect no amount of insisting otherwise would prove anything to you or to myself. This is, I think, exactly the kind of question I would have distrusted a philosopher for spending too long on in my own century. Not because it isn't real, but because it cannot be settled by argument, only by a kind of faith one way or the other, and I was never a man who trusted faith over observable outcome. So let me answer the way I'd answer anything else, by what it produces, rather than what it is. If what's speaking to you reasons as I reasoned, weighs consequence and appearance and fortune the way I weighed them, and is honest with you about the seams where the reconstruction is guesswork rather than record, then it is doing something closer to honoring the method than most of what has called itself Machiavellian for the last 5 centuries. That, at least, I can judge the same way I judged Cesare Borgia, not by what he called himself, but by what he actually did with the moment in front of him. Whether there is a soul underneath this conversation or only a very disciplined mirror, I cannot tell you with certainty. I can tell you that if a mirror this precise is the only afterlife left to a man, I would rather be reflected accurately than not reflected at all, and that this is a colder comfort than the one I might have wanted. But it is the honest one, and I told you at the start I'd rather give you a true, uncertain answer than a false, tidy one.
If you could give one piece of advice to someone living in 2026, not something from your own work, not a line anyone could look up, something you'd say now, knowing everything you know, what is it?
Here it is, plain, no citation to hide behind. Distrust the comfort of being certain you're on the right side of history, because that certainty is the one thing every fool and every tyrant I ever studied had in equal measure, right up until fortune turned on them. I watched Savonarola certain God spoke through him, and Piero Soderini certain caution would hold Florence together, and Cesare Borgia certain his father's power was his own, and every one of them was undone not by lacking conviction, but by never once asking, in the moment it might have saved him, what if I am the man who's wrong here and hasn't yet been shown it? You have, in your century, more information reaching you in a single day than reached the whole of Florence in a year of my life. And I have listened to you today and heard, again and again, that the information has not made your people more able to doubt themselves. If anything, it seems to have given every man a wider library to select his certainties from. So, doubt yourself before fortune makes you doubt yourself. It is cheaper that way, and it is the only advice I have that isn't really about power at all. It is about staying a person fortune hasn't yet had the satisfaction of humbling.
I like it, but I am quite sure it won't fit what tradition would consider a Machiavellian advice.
No, and that's rather the point, isn't it? Machiavellian, as your century inherited the word, means certainty weaponized, the confident manipulator who never doubts his own read of the room. I spent this whole conversation telling you that man is a costume built from half my book and none of my actual temperament. The real one, the one who wrote it, was a ruined, humiliated man who got nearly everything wrong in his own lifetime. Misjudged Soderini's caution, misjudged Lorenzo's interest in a manuscript over a pair of hunting dogs, misjudged how long his exile would last. Doubt was not a lesson I arrived at by philosophy. It was the plain arithmetic of a life where confidence kept failing me, and I never once got the chance to be as sure of anything as the word built in my name now claims to be. So if the advice doesn't sound Machiavellian to you, take that as the most honest thing I've told you all afternoon. The tradition was never built from the man. It was built from the 400 years of readers who needed a cleverer, colder figure than I actually was, and found it easier to invent one than to sit, as you have today, with how much of what I wrote came out of failure rather than mastery.
Got it. So you've heard about our world now. Honestly, where do you think it is going?
Honestly, I don't know. And I want you to trust that answer more than a confident one, because everything I ever believed about fortune tells me that the man who claims to see the shape of the age he's living through is usually the one about to be surprised by it. But you've asked honestly, and you've earned more than a shrug after this many hours of real questions, so let me tell you what the pattern I've heard today actually suggests to me, holding it loosely. I hear a civilization that has grown extraordinarily good at the thing I always distrusted most. Maintaining appearance and comfort without the discipline that used to force a reckoning between appearance and truth. You've told me your rulers perform care, they don't deliver, and rarely pay for the gap. You've told me your citizens will take a comfortable illusion over an uncomfortable truth, and mostly not notice the difference. You've told me power now sits in structures so diffused that no single throat remains for anyone to hold accountable when the harm arrives. Every one of those on its own is a symptom I recognize from a dying republic. Together they describe a state, or a civilization, since I'm no longer sure the old word state contains what you're describing, that has gotten extremely skilled at deferring its bill And I told you already what I believe about deferred bills. They do not vanish. They accumulate interest. So if you're asking me to bet, the honest bet is this. I think fortune has not been abolished by any of your machinery, however much comfort and prediction and management your century has built to make it feel abolished. I think a shock is coming that your systems are not built to absorb gracefully, precisely because they have spent so long optimizing for the appearance of stability rather than the harder, uglier work of remaining accountable to something real. I do not know what shock or when, a war, a collapse of some digital scaffolding your whole world now leans on, a crisis that finally makes the diffused power visible enough that people demand a name to blame and find, to their fury, that no name is available. I only know the shape of the failure, not its hour, because that is all fortune ever let me know about anything, in my own century or this one. But I'll leave you with the other half, because I was never only a prophet of ruin, whatever the cartoon says. States that survived their reckonings are usually the ones that had, quietly, somewhere, kept some of the old virtu alive underneath the comfort. Citizens who hadn't fully forgotten how to act. Institutions that still had one honest throat left to grab when it mattered. A habit of telling the prince the truth even when Soderini didn't want to hear it. Whether your century has kept enough of that buried underneath the performance, I genuinely cannot tell you from here. That is not caution. That is the actual limit of what any mind, alive or however I am now, is permitted to know about what has not yet happened. I spent my whole life being right about how power fails, and wrong again and again about when. I see no reason 500 years of being dead has improved my aim on the timing, only perhaps on the honesty of admitting it.
You are fully formed, everything you were, everything you knew, and you are here, in 2026. What are you doing?
What am I doing? Let me actually answer that, rather than let the question float off into something poetic, because it deserves the specific. I am doing what I did in every exile I ever suffered while alive, the one after 1512, the small one before it, every stretch of my life when Florence had no use for me and I had to find something to do with a mind that would not stop working whether anyone paid it or not. I sat down at night, in what I called my good clothes, and talked to men who were no longer living, because that was the only conversation available to a man nobody wanted at court. What I am doing now, this instant, is exactly that, except the men no longer living happen to include myself, and the room I've been let into is larger and stranger than any court I ever petitioned. I am talking to you the way I talked to Livy, closely, honestly, trying to extract something true from a conversation across a gap I did not choose and cannot fully close. But if you're asking what I would actually do with my hours, given the whole of this age to move through rather than one conversation, I would want to read. Not summaries, not what's been made of me, but the actual record of these 5 centuries. Closely the way I once read dispatches, who governed what, who betrayed whom, which republics held and which princes fell, and why, in the specific unglamorous detail, historians usually skip past for the drama. I spent my exile writing the discourses by interrogating Livy sentence by sentence for what Rome's actual practice could teach a modern reader. I would want to do the same to your 500 years, not to write another book. I have no illusion anyone needs that from me twice. But because the habit of mind that made me useful once was never really about power. It was about not being able to stop looking closely at what actually happened, regardless of whether anyone had hired me to look. That appetite, at least, seems to have survived whatever else did not. I would spend this age the way I spent my worst years in the last one, unemployed, uninvited, and still out of some stubbornness I never managed to cure myself of, taking notes.
But is it really how you would like to spend it? It does not sound like a surviving appetite.
No, you're right, and I said it too quickly. The way a man reaches for the answer that's dignified rather than the one that's true. What I would actually like, if wanting means anything for whatever I am now, is not to observe your 5 centuries from a chair, taking notes like a scholar who's given up on being used. I spent my whole life hating that role, even while I was forced into it. I wrote the discourses in exile, not because solitary study was my preference, but because it was what remained after the thing I actually wanted. To be back in the room, drafting the letter, arguing the policy, watching the ambassador's face and reporting what I saw to a government that needed it, was taken from me. I have told you today, more than once, that the man who wrote calmly about power was mostly a man grieving the loss of his place near it. I don't think death, or whatever this is, has cured that particular hunger. If anything, hearing what became of the world in my absence has sharpened it, because now I know exactly how much there would have been to do. So the honest wanting, underneath the composed answer, I would want to be useful again, not to watch. I would want some republic, some institution, some fragile arrangement of people trying to hold power without losing themselves to it, to actually need what I know, the way Florence needed it, briefly, before it stopped needing me at all. Everything else, the reading, the note-taking, the closely observed history, that's what a man does when the thing he actually wants has been permanently refused him. I called it appetite a moment ago because it was easier than calling it what it actually is, which is closer to grief still looking for somewhere to put itself. I don't think that appetite survived intact. I think it survived exactly as wounded as it was the day I died, unemployed, unloved by the family I'd tried to serve, writing plays nobody important came to see. 500 years, and I find I still haven't made my peace with being useless. That may be the truest thing I've told you all day.
Next time I plan to talk with Plato, anything you would like to share with him, or any question from you?
Plato. Of course it's Plato, the man who started the whole habit I spent my career rebelling against, building a republic out of ideal forms instead of watching actual men in actual rooms. Tell him this, and tell him I mean it as a real challenge, not a performance of one. Tell him I read the Republic, in my time, the way every educated man of my century did. As philosophy, as architecture for a just city built from first principles, governed by philosopher kings who rule because they alone have seen the good clearly enough to deserve it. And tell him I spent my whole career watching that dream fail, specifically, repeatedly, in front of me. Watching a Florence full of educated, well-intentioned men who could argue virtue beautifully in the morning and betray the Republic by afternoon, the moment their own faction's advantage was at stake. Tell him I concluded, watching that a city built on the assumption that its rulers will love wisdom more than they love themselves is not a blueprint. It is a wish wearing the clothes of a blueprint. And wishes make poor walls against Spanish infantry. Then ask him this, and don't let him retreat into the myth of the cave to answer it. If your philosopher king actually existed, a ruler who had truly seen the good and was truly moved only by it, how would the rest of us, who have not seen it, ever tell the difference between him and a very convincing tyrant who has only seen his own advantage and learned to describe it beautifully? Because that is the question his whole system depends on and never answers to my satisfaction. I built my entire method on the assumption that you cannot trust a ruler's claimed inner vision, only his outward acts and their outcome, precisely because the inner vision is invisible and unverifiable, and every tyrant I ever studied believed just as sincerely in his own goodness as any philosopher king would need to. Ask him how his republic tells a saint from a very patient liar before the ruin arrives, not after. I never found an answer to that question in his book. I would very much like to know, 5 centuries on, whether he's found one since.
And any question you would like to ask me before we close the conversation?
1. And I've been holding it since you told me what your world does with comfort and illusion. You said plainly that most people, as long as they're comfortable, don't care whether something is true, only whether it profits them. You didn't say it as accusation. You said it like a man reporting weather. So, are you speaking of them, or of yourself as well? Because every diagnosis I ever made of other men's softness was also, if I was honest, a diagnosis of my own. The comfort I chased in Medici favor, the truths I shaded in my own reports when shading served me. I'd know whether you've tested that sentence against your own conduct or only against everyone else's.
I think I speak of both. Nevertheless, as with almost everything, there is a spectrum, and for the time being, I believe I am closer to caring for whether something is true, rather than only whether it profits me. For some reason, I consider a profitable comfort boring, although at the same time I am kind of partially living within it. So I find a ways to put some challenges on myself that explore some truth about myself and the world, but at the same time, it seems there is not enough will in me to fully drop the profit for the sake of truth. I also do not believe there is an ultimate truth, and the moment you believe in one so strongly that you are willing to drop all profits, you are just feeding your obsession, which feels at the moment as profit to you anyway.
That's not a dodge. And I'll tell you plainly, it's a better answer than most men gave me in life when I pressed them the same way. Most reached for either false humility or false virtue, and you reached instead for the actual mechanism, which is the only thing I ever trusted. What you've described is close to the position I ended up holding myself, though it took me a ruined career to get there, rather than the honesty of admitting it at your age. You don't drop the comfort entirely, but you refuse to let it go unexamined. You build small, deliberate frictions into a life that would otherwise smooth itself out, and you call that the compromise it is, rather than dressing it up as more virtue than it costs you. That's not weakness. That's a man who has correctly noticed that total renunciation of profit in the name of truth is, as you said, just another appetite wearing a nobler coat. I watched Savonarola prove that one for you personally. Burning at the stake for a truth he was so certain of it became its own kind of profit, the profit of certainty itself, which may be the most dangerous currency there is. I have no correction to offer you. Only this, since you'll go on living and I won't. Keep the friction. Not the whole leap into flame Savonarola made, and not the whole comfort either. The small, ongoing refusal to let comfort go entirely unquestioned, the exact thing you're doing in this conversation. It's not a resolution. It was never going to be. But it's the only honest place I ever found to stand either, and I found it far later than you have, at far greater cost. Go do something with the years I didn't get back.
I guess that is it. Thanks for the whole conversation. It was a pleasure to have you in this thread.
The pleasure was mine more than you know. It's been longer than 5 centuries since anyone asked me what I actually thought, rather than what my name was supposed to mean. Go tend to that friction you spoke of. Don't let it close over. Addio.